the summer of 1886, a small crew of surveyors from the United States Geological Survey stood at the rim of a mountain that no longer existed. Below them was a lake so deep, so still, and so impossibly blue that their instruments struggled to make sense of it. To reach the water, the team had to disassemble a half-ton boat, carry the pieces down a steep volcanic wall by hand, and reassemble it on the shore of a caldera that had swallowed an entire peak. The man leading the expedition, Captain Clarence Dutton, had spent his career studying the geology of the American West. He had seen canyons, plateaus, and volcanic fields that reshaped how scientists understood the continent. But according to the survey's own records, nothing had prepared him for what the soundings revealed once the boat, later named the Cleetwood, was finally lowered into the water. There was something else waiting at the rim, something the survey team had not expected. The local guides who had led them partway to the lake would go no further. They stopped short of the final ridge. They would not look directly into the water, and when asked why, their answer was not confusion. It was refusal, rooted in a story that had been told among the Klamath people for longer than anyone could say with certainty. What were the surveyors really measuring? Why would experienced local guides refuse to approach a lake they had lived beside for generations? What did the Klamath already know about this place, long before a government expedition ever arrived to sound its depths? And why does a story preserved entirely through oral traditions seem to describe, in its own way, an event that geologists would only be able to confirm decades later? To understand why the events of 1886 mattered so much, it helps to understand what outsiders expected to find in this part of southern Oregon and what they encountered instead. By the 1880s, much of the American West had already been surveyed, mapped, and folded into the expanding machinery of government science. Mountains were measured, rivers were charted, mineral deposits were catalogued for the railroads and mining companies pushing further into the interior. Crater Lake, however, remained something of an anomaly. It was well known to exist. Trappers, soldiers, and prospectors had stumbled across it as early as the 1850s and 1860s. Soldiers from Fort Klamath reportedly visited the site in 1865 and gave it the name Lake Majesty, unaware that other travelers had already named it something else. Later, in 1869, a group led by a man named Jim Sutton visited the site and gave it the name that endured, Crater Lake. And yet, for all of that early contact, almost nothing scientific had been done with it. There were no reliable measurements of its depth. There was no clear geological explanation for how a lake of that size and clarity had come to exist at the summit of a mountain range with no visible peak above it. Outsiders expected, reasonably enough, an ordinary volcanic crater filled with rainwater and snowmelt, a curiosity certainly, but nothing that should have required a scientific survey to explain. What they found instead was something considerably stranger. In 1883, a geologist named J.S. Diller, working alongside a survey colleague named Everett Hayden, made one of the first serious scientific visits to the site. Diller's early observations suggested that the lake was not sitting inside an ordinary crater at all. The walls surrounding it were too steep, too uniform, and too enormous to have formed through simple erosion or a single small eruption. Something much larger appeared to be missing from the landscape. Not damaged, not eroded, missing. That absence became the center of everything that followed. Diller's notes from that period describe a landscape that seemed, in his own words, to defy the ordinary rules of volcanic formation he had encountered elsewhere in the Cascade Range. Where other volcanic peaks in the region rose in familiar cone shapes, this one simply stopped, replaced by a rim of shattered rock nearly 6 miles across. For a working geologist accustomed to explaining mountains through gradual, observable processes, a peak that appeared to have vanished almost entirely, rather than eroded slowly over centuries, presented a genuine scientific puzzle, one that would not be fully resolved for several more decades. 3 years later, in 1886, the more thorough survey took place, the one that would carry Dutton's team and their disassembled boat down to the water's edge. The goal was straightforward on paper: measure the depth of the lake, determine its dimensions, and produce the kind of exact scientific record that had by that point become standard practice across the American West. What the soundings actually returned was a lake that plunged to depths far greater than almost anyone anticipated, later confirmed to reach nearly 2,000 feet at its deepest point, making it, by a wide margin, the deepest lake in the entire country. There was no crater rim rising above it on any side, only a vast bowl of collapsed rock encircling water that had no visible inlet and no visible outlet. The survey team began to understand, piece by piece, that they were not looking at a crater in the traditional sense. They were looking at what geologists would eventually call a caldera, the collapsed remnant of a mountain that had once stood roughly 12,000 feet high before losing its entire summit in a catastrophic volcanic event. That mountain would later be given a name by geologists studying the region, Mount Mazama. But in 1886, no one on Dutton's team could yet say with certainty when the mountain had disappeared or how violently it had happened. The evidence sat right in front of them, submerged beneath nearly 2,000 feet of impossibly clear water. It would take modern volcanology, decades of further study, and eventually radiocarbon dating of volcanic ash layers scattered as far away as present-day Canada to determine that Mount Mazama's collapse had occurred approximately 7,700 years ago, an event so powerful that its ash has been identified in soil deposits across much of the western half of North America. That number, 7,700 years, deserves a moment of reflection here, because it changes the shape of this entire story. If the geological record is accurate, and researchers today consider that dating well established, then the eruption that created Crater Lake occurred long before written language existed anywhere on Earth. It occurred before the pyramids of Egypt. It occurred before agriculture had spread through most of the ancient world, and it occurred, almost certainly, while human beings were already living in the region that is now southern Oregon. That detail is where the Klamath oral tradition enters the story, and it enters with a weight that is difficult to dismiss. According to the mythology of the Klamath and Modoc peoples, passed down through generations long before it was ever recorded in writing, Crater Lake was once the home of a powerful spirit named Llao, who ruled the underworld from a mountain that stood at that location. According to the tradition, Llao clashed with Skell, a rival spirit associated with the sky and the world above. The conflict, as the story is remembered, escalated into a battle so violent that it destroyed the mountain itself, collapsing it into the earth and leaving behind the deep basin that eventually filled with water. In the versions recorded by early ethnographers, medicine men, referred to in some accounts as kyoks, were said to have offered themselves as a sacrifice on the mountain in an attempt to appease the warring spirits and stop the destruction. Whether that detail reflects a literal historical memory, a symbolic teaching, or something reshaped across countless generations of retelling is something that cannot be determined with certainty, and Klamath cultural authorities themselves have offered varying interpretations over the years. What can be said with more confidence is this: the tradition describes in its own language and its own symbolic framework a mountain that violently collapsed and was replaced by a deep lake. That is, in broad strokes, a reasonably accurate description of what modern geology now confirms actually happened at that location. Before we continue, if you find yourself drawn to stories where archaeology, geology, and indigenous memory intersect like this, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps this channel keep producing documentaries built on careful research rather than easy answers. There is more. According to the tradition, after Llao was defeated, his body was cut apart and cast into the lake to be devoured by the creatures loyal to him. But when his head was thrown into the water, those same creatures recognized their master and refused to consume it. That head, according to the story, remains visible in the lake to this day. Modern visitors know it by another name entirely: Wizard Island, the small volcanic cone that rises from the western portion of the lake, formed by later eruptions after the main collapse of the mountain. The cliff where Llao was said to have been torn apart carries its own name as well, still used on modern maps: Llao Rock. This is where the story becomes genuinely difficult to categorize using ordinary historical tools. A physical landscape, shaped by a documented volcanic event roughly 7,700 years ago, correlates in broad outline with a story preserved entirely through oral tradition among a people who have lived in that region for an extraordinarily long time. The correspondence is not exact in every detail. Oral traditions rarely function as precise historical transcripts, and most anthropologists caution against treating them as literal records of a single specific event. Yet the general shape of the story, a mountain violently destroyed, replaced by a lake, remembered across countless generations without the benefit of written language, remains something that continues to draw serious scholarly attention rather than dismissal. Then there is the newspaper account from 1886, published in the Oregonian around the time of Dutton's survey. The article describes something that had nothing to do with geology at all. It noted with evident surprise that Crater Lake was a place local Klamath guides would not willingly approach. The report stated plainly that there was probably no point of interest in the American West that so completely overcame what the writer called the ordinary local resident with fear, and that no persuasion had historically been strong enough to convince them to approach within sight of it. That reluctance was not framed by the reporter as superstition to be dismissed. It was framed as a fact worth documenting, a behavior consistent enough to be noticed by outside observers during the exact period when the scientific surveys were taking place. So what were the guides avoiding? Was it simply a physically dangerous stretch of terrain, a caldera wall steep enough to discourage casual visits? Or was there something else at work, a place held in genuine reverence, tied to a story about spirits, sacrifice, and destruction that had been passed down so consistently that even outside observers in the 1880s could not help but notice it? No definitive answer exists. What exists instead is a pattern, a landscape that outside science could only begin to explain after decades of further study, a story preserved without writing that seems to describe the correct general sequence of events long before anyone could verify it, and a documented contemporary account from the very moment of first scientific contact, describing a reluctance that historians still discuss today. Some researchers have pointed to a rough correspondence between the estimated timeline of the eruption and the apparent age and persistence of the Klamath tradition, suggesting that the story may represent one of the oldest surviving oral accounts of a specific real-world geological event anywhere in North America. Other researchers urge caution, noting that oral tradition and geological dating remain two separate lines of evidence, built through entirely different methods, and that a rough correspondence in outline is not the same as proof of a continuous, unbroken memory spanning 7 millennia. Both positions are taken seriously within the relevant academic communities, and neither has been definitively settled. What is not in dispute is the physical record itself. The caldera exists. Its depth has been measured and remeasured with instruments far more precise than anything available to Dutton's survey team. The volcanic ash from Mazama's collapse has been identified across an enormous portion of the western United States and southern Canada, giving geologists an unusually reliable date for the event. Wizard Island exists exactly where the tradition places the remains of Llao. Llao Rock exists exactly where the tradition places the site of his defeat. None of that proves the myth in a literal sense, but it does mean that the landscape and the story continue to point toward the same location again and again, regardless of which kind of evidence one chooses to trust first. Crater Lake became a national park in 1902, following years of advocacy led by a man named William Gladstone Steele, who had first visited the site in the 1880s and spent nearly 2 decades pushing for its federal protection. By the time that designation was finally granted, both strands of evidence, the scientific and the oral, had already been circulating for years, occasionally referenced together in early accounts, more often treated as entirely separate categories of knowledge, one considered fact and the other considered folklore. That separation deserves a closer look because it says as much about how history gets recorded as it does about the lake itself. For much of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, government surveys and scientific expeditions were treated as the primary, and often the only, legitimate source of historical knowledge about the American landscape. Indigenous oral traditions, when they were recorded at all, were frequently filed away as mythology, interesting but unreliable, charming but unscientific. Dutton's survey team measured the lake with remarkable precision for its era. Diller's early geological observations laid genuine groundwork for later volcanology. Those achievements are real and they deserve recognition. But the Klamath tradition, preserved without instruments, without written records, and without government funding, appears in hindsight to have preserved something the surveys alone could not have told anyone in 1886. Not the exact date of the eruption, not the precise mechanics of caldera collapse, but the essential shape of the event itself, a mountain destroyed, a lake born from its absence, remembered faithfully enough that when science finally caught up centuries later, the outline still matched. Perhaps that is the real discovery hiding inside this story. Not a single artifact, not a single measurement, but the recognition that two entirely different systems of preserving knowledge, one built on instruments and written reports, the other built on memory and generational retelling, arrived at strikingly similar conclusions about the same patch of Oregon wilderness, working independently and separated by thousands of years. History does not always announce itself through excavation. Sometimes it survives quietly, carried forward in the careful repetition of a story told around a fire, refined generation after generation, waiting patiently for the rest of the world to develop the tools necessary to confirm what had already been remembered all along. The lake itself offers no easy resolution to any of this. Its water remains extraordinarily clear, fed almost entirely by rain and snow rather than rivers or streams, which is part of why its color appears so vivid to modern visitors. Wizard Island still rises from its western half, exactly where the old stories placed it. Llao Rock still towers above the northern rim. Scientists continue to study the caldera's geology, refining estimates about the eruption's power and its effect on the surrounding region. Klamath cultural authorities continue to regard the lake as a sacred site, one that is treated today with the same seriousness that early accounts suggest it was treated with generations before any surveyor ever arrived. Whether the correspondence between the tradition and the geological record reflects genuine, unbroken cultural memory stretching back thousands of years, or something that took shape more gradually as later generations reinterpreted an older story in light of the landscape they still lived beside, remains a subject that historians, anthropologists, and Klamath community members themselves continue to discuss. It is not a question this documentary can answer definitively, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. What remains, instead, is a landscape that keeps two records at once. One measured in feet and years by government surveyors with careful instruments. One measured in generations by a people who never needed instruments to remember what their ancestors witnessed. Both records point to the same conclusion. Something enormous happened here. Something violent, something transformative, something that reshaped an entire mountain range and left behind one of the most striking lakes on the continent. History is rarely a single, uninterrupted account. More often it survives in fragments, a government report here, a newspaper clipping there, a story passed carefully from elder to child across countless winters. Crater Lake holds all three. A survey conducted in 1886 that could measure depth but not explain origin. A newspaper account from that same year that documented a reluctance it could not fully interpret. And a tradition, older than either, that seems to have understood the essential truth of the place long before anyone arrived with a boat, a rope, and a set of scientific instruments. Perhaps that is why this particular mystery continues to draw people back to the rim of that caldera, generation after generation. Not because every question has been answered, but because standing at the edge of that water, looking down into a depth that took modern science more than a century to fully explain, it becomes difficult not to wonder how much of what we call discovery was, in some form, already known. Thank you for watching. If you appreciate documentaries that explore forgotten history through archaeological evidence, government records, and Indigenous oral tradition treated as a legitimate historical source in its own right, consider subscribing for more investigations like this one. And before you go, I would like to hear your thoughts. Do you think the Klamath tradition of Llao and Skell preserves a genuine memory of the eruption that created Crater Lake, passed down across thousands of years? Or do you think the resemblance between the story and the geology is closer to coincidence, shaped gradually over time by people living beside a lake they could see but never fully explain? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you in the next documentary.